Hello there, and welcome to this video on the Daystate Pulsar. In our previous video, we took a fully functioning and complete rifle and broke it down into individual components. In this video, we're going to be taking those individual components and rebuilding them into a working rifle. Before we get started, on your screen now will be a complete list of all the tools that we're going to use in order to carry out this reassembly procedure. It includes all of the Allen key sizes, all of the spanner sizes, and finally any Daystate specific tooling required to complete the job. The last thing I want to mention is that this particular rifle is a 177 sub 12 pound rifle. However, the information in this guide will also be relevant to the other power levels and the other calibers. With that said, the first thing we're going to concentrate on is the trigger assembly. We're going to start off with the safety. And what we need to do is get the safety bar installed into this hole in the side of the trigger, with the red side aligned with the left-hand side of the rifle. Next, we can drop this sleeve here into this hole in the end there, making sure to align the slot with the hole in the side of the block. With that done, we can take this spring here and drop that through the center of the part that we just installed, getting that centered using something like a pair of tweezers. With that done, we need to take this pin here and install it through this hole here. As we do that, we do need to depress the small spring that we've just put in. To do that, what I like to do is use a small punch, push the spring down, whilst also pushing in the pin. With that done, the safety should go backwards and forwards nicely, and there should be a detent to it. You can also see the plunger rising and falling as we push the safety from back to front. Up next, we're going to install the laser and the switches into the trigger housing. To begin with, we'll take our laser assembly and aligning the wires along the cutout in the side of the assembly, we can push that into place. Being nice and careful as we push it in, not to pinch the wires between the laser housing and the trigger assembly. Once that's done, we can get the two securing grub screws done up nice and tightly with a 2mm Allen key. With that done, we can make sure the switches are in the correct position and then start to secure them using the small screws. Right, so what I've gone ahead and done is just got the first switch put into its final position. So we have the two screws on this side, the two captive nuts on this side, and if we take a quick look at the switch position, you can see that the switch is being arrested by the housing itself. So the shoe of the switch is being held up by the housing. It's very important to get that in position, as if the shoe is down, the trigger may not function correctly. So I'll just get you one more close look at that. Hopefully the camera will focus on it, but the switch there is being arrested by the housing. With that in position, we can do the same for the switch up here. This is the safety switch, so we're just going to be installing the nuts first. Just like so. We can then hold them in position with our finger, add our small screws, I do apologise for the camera position. It's actually quite tricky to show what's happening and for me to do the work, so I'm not sure how much you're going to be able to see in this little demonstration, but hopefully you can get the gist of what I'm talking about. The next thing we're going to do is adjust the position of the switches until they function as they should. So for now, we're just going to hook both of the switches up, loosen off these screws just a tad so that the switches move, then tighten them down into rough position. What we want to do now is test the switches and keep adjusting them until we can hear the click. So at the moment we can't hear this switch at the back here clicking. So we need to move it up slightly, tighten it into position, then retest it. Right then, so I've got the two switches adjusted where they should be. The trigger one, if we listen nice and carefully, hopefully the microphone will pick that up, but the trigger one is clicking as it should. And the safety one, so the one in the back here, is non-contacting when the rifle is on fire. So if we lift the trigger shoe, we can again hear the small click. And then when we put the rifle on safe, the switch is depressed and the rifle can no longer fire, and the switch is depressed, so the safety is on. That sounds much more complicated than it actually is, but just keep in mind that both switches need to be operational, and the safety one should be fully depressed when the rifle is on safe. With that done, we can start putting the trigger pieces back in, starting off with the blade, hooking that into position, nice and carefully, then lining the two holes up in the side of the action here. Then we can put this small pin through the two pieces to join them together. And again, we can test that the trigger switch is working by listening for the click. So hopefully the microphone will pick that up. Next up, we can put the spring plate back, and we're going to be getting that installed using a cross-headed screwdriver. As you install that, just make sure that you keep the trigger back so that the plate goes down flush. Up next, we're going to be doing a little bit of cable management, and what I'm going to be doing is just putting a small amount of black electrical tape across this connection here, just to keep the wires in place whilst we carry out further assembly of the rifle. With that done, we can then get the trigger installed onto the trigger plate, making sure that the wires don't get pinched as we install it. Putting everything together just like that, then installing the two securing screws. We can get those done up nice and tightly with a 4mm Allen key. And before you do those up tight, just make sure that the wires haven't become pinched. So I'm quite happy there, we can do them up nice and tight. And then once again, we're just going to be doing a little bit of cable management, pushing the cable into its seat, then covering that over with just some black electrical tape. You can wrap it over the top, but I would recommend cutting the other side off, just with a nice sharp blade. Right then, next up we're going to be reassembling the board sub-assembly. So to begin with, we're going to be taking our clear insulating piece, this piece here, and then dropping that on the board, lining up the holes with the holes in the board. Next we can take our trigger plate and get that dropped over the top, again lining the holes up with the holes in the trigger plate, making sure everything is lined up as it should be. Then we can drop that over the small screen side here. With that done, we can flip the whole sub-assembly over, being careful not to drop anything, and then install the 3 securing screws, getting everything lined up, then screwed lightly into position. I like to get all 3 started, make sure that there's nothing pinched where it shouldn't be, and then get all 3 done up nice and tight. With that done, we can get the cocking indicator hooked back up, so that's just that switch there. Hooks into place nicely like so. Then we can attach the battery cable as well. So these connections do have an orientation. Hopefully the camera will pick it up, but there's a small cutout on one side, and that needs to be aligned with the cutout in the side of the connection. Here we have it. Get that pushed into position. And then lastly we can get the battery holder installed. Getting that secured using the 2 countersunk bolts. Getting those done up nice and tightly with a 2mm Allen key. Right then, next thing we'll do is reinstall the valve and the magazine indexing system. To begin with, we'll start by adding a small amount of silicone grease to both of these O-rings here. Just a small amount will do us. Then a little bit on this one on the back. Wiping off the excess with our fingers. We don't need tons on this component here. The next thing we'll do is get that pushed into position. So we need to align the transfer port hole as well as this cupped hole with this hole and the transfer port inside the block. So it should go something like that. There we have it there. The next thing we can do is drop this small O-ring into the hole. And there's just this one here. It needs to seat in the small counter bore in the bottom of the valve. So we're going to get that pushed into position. Then we can come over with the small cup, get that dropped into position. The cup itself should just fall into the valve without too much resistance, but if it doesn't want to line up, it just simply means that the valve isn't in the correct place, so we just need to manipulate it slightly and get it so it all lines up. There we have it. So the cup is installed into the valve. The next thing we can do is add our little plunger piece. So this plunger piece has 2 sides, a long side with a stepped section. This needs to be facing up. Push that into position, into the cup. Then we can top that off with the small spring, which is just this one here. And then we can get that topped off with this plate here. And get that secured in place by using the 2 long M3 screws, getting those done up with a 2mm Allen key. Whilst I'm installing this last screw, I did also want to mention that if you wanted to convert your Pulsar to use the latest magazines, so the self-winding magazines, you could also install the small blanking plate instead of the indexing pin. That would allow you to use the new style self-winding mags over the old style indexing mags. So if you wanted to do that, the plunger is available. It's exactly the same one that's used on the Red Wolf. But with that said, we'll get the screws done up nice and tight. The next thing we'll do is install the hammer assembly. So here's all the parts. The first thing we're going to do is take our spacer washer, this one here, and drop that into the end of the action, making sure that seats nicely into the bottom. Up next, we're going to be taking our coil, and whilst keeping the wires nice and out the way, we can gently slide that into position. And once it's in rough alignment, we can hook the coil wires through this little slot in the bottom of the block. Nice and carefully, just like so. With that done, we can take this spacer piece here, so this is the plastic hammer housing, we can push that in the back of the block, then get the small cutout aligned with the coil wires. Up next, we can take our hammer and hammer return spring and get those installed. The hammer return spring is tapered, the shallow end goes towards the back of the hammer, the larger end goes towards the front of the rifle. Get that dropped into position. We can then top that off with our wave ring. And then we can get this rear piece installed. As this goes in, we will need to depress this plunger in order to get it to seat correctly. Once it's in the right position, it should lock into place and become flush with the back of the block. Next up, we can secure that in place by reinstalling the 2 securing screws. Now on this rifle, the original ones were these 3-pin anti-tamper screws. However, I'm going to be replacing these for just plain high tensile M3 bolts. This will just make it a little easier to service next time. However, you could reinstall the anti-tamper bolts if you wanted to. These bolts here are high tensile M3 countersunk bolts, and they're 10mm in length, including the head. So the overall length of the bolt is 10mm. But we can get those screwed into position using a 2mm Allen key. Before we assemble the cocking arm and the pellet probe, I do just very briefly want to mention that you can reverse the cocking handle side. So at the moment it's on the right hand side, but if you wanted to install it on the left hand side, you would simply need to remove this spacer plate in the back here by loosening these 2 screws here using a 2mm Allen key, take that plate out and flip it over to this side. Once you've done that, you can just install the cocking arm and pellet probe exactly the same from the other side. Right then, the next thing we're going to do is rebuild the cocking arm assembly and get it installed into the block. First thing we'll do is take our cocking arm and just add a small amount of moly grease to the inside of this groove here. Just a small amount will do us. If you didn't have access to moly grease, you could also just use plain lithium grease. But with that said, we can then add this small spring to this hole here, being nice and careful, pushing that into position with something like a small screwdriver. Then we can add the small ball bearing to the top of it, this one here. With that done, we can take this arm here, and with it aligned like so, we can get that installed into the groove and secured using one of these little grub screws here. As this goes in, you will need to put a small amount of pressure on this side of the arm to get the hole to line up. And then once it's in rough alignment, we can take a flat-bladed screwdriver and get that done up nice and tightly. With that done, we'll just make sure it goes backwards and forwards nice and smoothly, which it does. Next thing we'll do is take our pellet probe, which is this piece here, and once again add a small amount of moly grease to the inside of this groove here. Again, just a small amount will do us, we don't need tons in this component. We can wipe off the excess with our fingers. What I'm going to do now is just add a very small amount of blue Loctite to these threads on the bottom here. Just a very small amount will do us, we don't want tons on this component here. But we do want to lightly lock in the bolt to stop it coming undone when the rifle is in use. So again, a very small amount will do us. With that done, we can flip the arm over and keeping everything in this alignment here, we can line the hole up. Then install our small securing and pivot grub screw. Getting that done up once again with a nice flat-bladed screwdriver. With that done, the next thing we can do is put a small amount of moly grease over the outside of the pellet probe, putting a little bit on, then wiping the excess off with our fingers. Can also put a little bit around this component here, just at this end, both sides. Again, just wiping the excess off with our fingers and getting a small amount in this hole here. We can then take our cocking arm bush, get that installed into the hole like so, wipe off the excess grease, then get that pushed through the block. To do this, we may have to just gently pull down on this cable here, pushing the component into place, just like that. Then we can use a 2.5mm Allen key and this screw here to secure the cocking arm in place. Then we can just make sure the cocking arm reciprocates nice and smoothly, which this one does. The next thing we're going to do is get the valve and the front housing reinstalled into the rifle. To start off with, we're going to be taking our valve, which is this piece here, and adding a small amount of silicone grease to the outside O-ring. Just a small amount will do us, we don't need tons on this component. Then we can get that dropped into the housing. If we take a close look at the valve, you can see it has a counterbore on one side and is flat on the other. The counterbore section needs to face up like so, and the flat side needs to lay face down. So make sure it lands like that inside the block. Next we can take our valve pin, push that through the valve itself, nice and carefully like so. Up next we can take our front housing and add a small amount of silicone grease to these two O-rings here. Then we can get that gently pushed into position. Once it's in position, we can take the two long screws and add them to the bottom, getting both of them started. And then we can take the two shorter screws and add them to the top. We're going to be getting these done up nice and tightly with a 4mm Allen key, although what I like to do first is just get these two top ones installed until they touch. Then what we can do then is push the housing all the way down, then tighten the two screws up. This will just hold the housing in place while we tighten the other two up. Before the screws get done up to their final tightness, we are just going to check that the block is nice and even on all sides, and that it's not misaligned or pushed off to one side, something like that. Once we're happy, we can take a 4mm Allen key and get everything done up nice and tight. And then before the trigger rail goes on, I am just going to be adding a bit of silicone grease to these two front O-rings. It's a little easier to do it now, as when the trigger rail goes on, the O-rings are obscured. Up next, we're going to get the pressure sensor and the main circuit board attached to the main block. The first thing we'll do is add the pressure sensor to this hole in the bottom of the block, getting that done up nice and tightly with an adjustable spanner. The next thing we can do is attach the main circuit board, and before that goes on, I am just going to add the pressure sensor to this wire in the top right hand corner. So there it is there, just that connection there. It's a little easier to do it when the board is off the rifle, as you can sort of manipulate it a little easier. With that done, the next thing we're going to do is line up the coil wires with this connection here. As you can see, I've already bent the coil wires out slightly so that they're nice and forked and they should go straight into the connection. We're just going to be getting that lined up nicely. Put in place like so, then we can secure that using the two screws here. So the coil wires just simply need to go in that connection in the middle of the screen, as you can see there. With that done, the next thing we can do is get the board secured to the main block. I'm going to do that by locating the trigger housing into the cutout in the block, then dropping this screw through the middle. We can get that done up nice and tightly with a 5mm Allen key. And there we have it. As you do that up tight, just make sure the trigger block is nice and in line with the rifle, it is possible to get the trigger block slightly misaligned with the main block if you're not careful. Next up, we're going to be attaching the trigger to the main block of the rifle, then we'll get the electronics covered over with the plastic cover. To start off with, we're going to be taking this connection here and adding it to this section of the board, so the one on the right. It's a little tricky to show for the camera as my fingers are in the way, but I'll give you a close-up on that very shortly. The next thing we're going to be doing is very carefully sliding the trigger assembly into its little slot, then securing that in place using this bolt here in this hole. The bolt itself does have a small spring washer beneath it, so just make sure that's in place. Then we can get that done up nice and tightly with a 17mm spanner. Here we have it. So there's the connection there. The connections themselves will only go in one way, so if the connection feels like you're forcing it, just take it out and have a look. And as you do this screw up, just make sure that you're not pinching this wire. With that all done, that's all of the electrical connections attached to the board. The next thing we need to do is cover that up with our little plastic cover piece. Before we do that though, I am just going to be adding a small amount of dielectric grease to each one of the connections, just to stop them from corroding under normal use. So just a small amount will do us. Once we're happy, we can get the plastic cover put over the top of the action. And before that goes in, we are just going to make sure all the wires are in their respective cutouts. So they should all line up with a small cutout in the plastic section. So just make sure that they're all pushed into their respective cutouts. Then we can add the plastic section. And then add the 3 securing screws. Before we do those up tight, we're just going to go through the block and make sure all the wires are in their cutouts still. So the 2 at the front here, there seems to be no wires pinched between the 2 halves of the plastic piece, so we can go ahead and do the screws up nice and tightly. Right then, the next thing we're going to do is reassemble the cylinder assembly. Starting off with this end here, the first thing we need to do is reattach the one-way valve and the Foster fitting. The brass sinter, so the sintered filter, is already installed as we didn't take that out in the disassembly process. Didn't take it out because typically they're done up fairly tight from the factory and they can be a little bit of a pain to remove. With that said, we can drop our washer in first, making sure that seats in the bottom nicely. Then we can take our one-way valve, add a small amount of silicone grease to the outside O-ring, wiping the excess off with our fingers. Then we can get that put into our Foster fitting, just like so. Wipe off the excess grease there. And then we can get that screwed into the front of this unit here. To get that done up nice and tightly, we're just going to be using a 16mm spanner. Getting that done up nice and tight, then we can get that installed into the front of the cylinder. Before that goes in, we are just going to be adding a small amount of silicone grease to these 2 O-rings here. Then we can get that screwed into the front of the cylinder. Again, you could either use a set of snap ring pliers in these 2 holes here, or I'm going to be using my pin spacing tool. Getting that done up nice and tightly, then we can add the cylinder to the main block of the rifle. We did already pre-grease these O-rings earlier, so we can just go ahead and install the cylinder. Right then, next thing we're going to do is get the shroud assembly rebuilt and then install the barrel into the rifle and top it off with the scope rail. To start off with, we're going to be taking our barrel and adding the shroud front support, lining these 2 grub screws up with these 2 dimples. Up next, we're going to take the rear support, this piece here, and install that along the rear of the barrel, getting these 3 grub screws aligned with these 2 dimples here. Just roughly for now, we'll do our final alignment in a minute. Next thing we can do is install the barrel into the block, and before that goes in, I'm just going to be adding a small amount of silicone grease to these 2 O-rings here. With that done, we can take our block, remove one of the grub screws from the top here, just like so, then install the barrel nice and carefully, aligning the dimples up with the holes in the top of the block. Once we're aligned, we can use a 2.5mm Allen key just to do the grub screws up nice and tightly. Up next, we're going to be installing the scope rail, so we'll put the shroud to one side for a second. Bring the block a little further down. Then we can loosen off the grub screw that we tightened earlier. Align the block like so. Get the holes in the top of the barrel roughly aligned with the top of the block. Then add our scope rail, aligning these 3 holes up with these 3 holes here. We can get that secured using the 3 screws that look something like that. Once all 3 are tightened, you'll see that we still have a little bit of movement in the scope rail. What we need to do is push the rail hard against the block, then move it forward a very slight amount. With that done, we can take a 2.5mm Allen key and just tighten up the grub screws. And I like to do one on either side at a time. And there we have it. You can see we have a little gap between the block and the shroud support. I like a gap between the block and the shroud support, as I find that the vibrations from the block don't travel through the shroud that way. But with that done, we can bring back over the shroud, and the first thing we can do is take our baffles, align them like so, so with the cone facing the back of the action, and then put those in there like that. We can top off that with the spring, get that pushed in. Right then, so the rebuild process is almost complete. The next thing we have to do is connect a battery pack and make sure that the rifle is fully functioning. So to do that, I'm just going to push the battery pack into the housing, nice and carefully like so, then connect the pack up. At this point, the screen lit up and you can see that we have no pressure in the system. The rifle is set to high power and we have a low pressure warning. What I'm going to do now is just a basic test of the functions and make sure everything is working as it should. So we'll flick the rifle off safe, we'll cock the rifle, then we'll fire the rifle. So that seems to be working as it should. We can then pull the cocking arm back, press and hold the trigger. We can enter programming mode. Magazine on off, power level, laser on off, magazine on off. So we have all the functions there. We can turn the laser on or off if we want to. And now we have the laser working as it should. We can then turn that off if we don't want it on by just using the menu once more. For those of you not aware, to enter programming mode on the Pulsar, you first need to open the cocking arm, press and hold the trigger. If I give you a close-up of the board there, you can see we've entered programming mode. We release the trigger, press and hold it once more, and then it cycles through the menu options. When we get to the one that we want, say power level, we release the trigger, and then subsequent trigger pulls will cycle through the menu options. High, medium and low power. Once we select the power setting that we want, we just simply push the bolt forward And as you can see there, it's now on high power. With that done, I'm happy that the rifle is functioning exactly as it should. I'll put the rifle on safe and then we can continue building the rifle up. The next thing I'm going to do is just add the cheek piece back to the rifle, and that's done by simply sliding it over the dovetail at the rear of the action, just like that. Then securing that in place using the two 2.5mm grub screws, just like so. The next thing I'm going to do is slide this plastic front on. Now the plastic front does have this little spacer piece in the middle. It's quite stiff, so this piece here should stay in place, although if it comes loose it just slides in the block there. So just there, like so. That can be slid over the cylinder, nice and carefully like that. Then it can be secured in place by attaching the cap at the end. With that done, the last thing we can put back on is the stock. And to install that, we simply need to flick the action on its side. Make sure the plastic piece at the front here is nice and aligned and not off to one side, so roughly in the middle like so. We can then take our stock, drop it over the action, making sure that nothing gets caught up. Then we can add our stock bolt, this one here, to this hole at the back here. Getting that done up nicely with a 5mm Allen key. The only other thing that I'll remind you about is to get the action inside the stock. The rifle does need to be on safe, so that the safety travels through the little cutout in the side of the stock. Right then, with that all said and done, that's the rifle fully rebuilt. The next thing to do would be to fill the rifle up with air, put the rifle over the chronograph, then leak test the rifle overnight. I'm going to be doing all of that work off camera, so for now guys, that's pretty much going to do it for this particular video. Thank you very much for watching. I hope it's been interesting or useful, and we'll see you in the next one.